there's a couple things that can happen. And we've talked about urbanization, right? Briefly. In a city, we pave things. We use concrete and bricks and cement and asphalt. And so those things, one of the problems with urbanization is that water used to just go into the ground, and now it can't. It has to go somewhere else. And we call that process runoff. Runoff is when it runs off the surface and goes somewhere else. Remember, we're 700 feet above sea level in Indiana. The excess water will flow because of gravity and eventually make its way all the way back to sea level, to one of the oceans. Now, that's a long process, obviously, and not every single drop makes it there. But it is theoretical that during a rainstorm, a drop of water could hit the parking lot and end up in the Gulf of Mexico. So when you think about that journey, if you look very carefully the next time you're at the school, where the buses normally park in the lot, you will see a drainage grate. And that's where the parking lot is actually built at an angle so that the water flows toward that drainage gate. And where does it go from there? Well, it goes down into the sewer system, which eventually leads to, around here, the White River. Where does it go from the White River?
The Wabash?
The Wabash, thank you. Yeah, so the White River flows into the Wabash River, which then heads south to Evansville and connects to a much bigger river.
Ohio?
The Ohio. And the Ohio then connects to the biggest river in the United States, which is the Mississippi, which then flows all the way down to Louisiana, New Orleans, and the Gulf of Mexico. So that's quite a journey, right? And that's really what today's lesson is about, that path getting all the way down to New Orleans. So what I just described to you is called a freshwater river system. So we're dealing with water on land, which means there's no salt in it. It's our oceans that are salty. And freshwater starts at what we call the headwaters. The head is the source, and it's going to be your highest elevations. So around here, the highest elevations are where the river starts. Year after year of rain eventually carves these paths as water finds the easiest route from the headwaters all the way back to the ocean. So those rivers that I was describing are called tributaries. You see that word down in the bottom right. A tributary is a small stream or river that flows into a larger one. So the White River is a tributary of the Wabash. The Wabash is a tributary of the Ohio, and so on. The place where they meet is called a confluence. You really probably don't need to know any of those river terms, but you've probably heard most of these before. So we look at the slope plays a huge role in how much soil erosion happens, and actually average residence time. If we spill pollution into that river, how long does it stay in the river? Well, depending on the elevation, it might move away pretty quickly. The steeper the elevation, the faster the water moves along the riverbed. All right. The mouth is where it all ends up into the larger body. In this case, Gulf of Mexico. In fact, I think New Orleans is very interesting, and we'll come back and talk about this later, but that's a beautiful image from space showing you what's happening in New Orleans. And remember, this is a city that is essentially built below sea level. It's big bowl shape. That's why hurricanes are a huge concern down there. So it's carrying dirt from Indiana. When I talked about how dirt comes from the bedrock last week, well, usually. But in a place like Louisiana, the dirt came from Indiana. It came from Iowa. It came from Illinois. It came from Ohio. All the places that feed into that river brought dirt with it. And we call that a transported soil. A transported soil means it came from somewhere else. Glaciers can do it as well. And you can see all that dirt getting poured into the Gulf of Mexico. And it built that little boot that's on the tip of Louisiana. That didn't used to be there. Our country looked a lot different. The bedrock underneath it does not match the soil. So yeah, that's all been added to our continent over millions of years of the river carrying dirt down below. And I just think it's beautiful to see the mix of soil, fresh water, and saltwater. We call that an estuary where they meet, and we define it as something called a brackish estuary. And that means that it is salty. Brackish means salty, saltwater mixing with fresh water. That word has shown up before on the AP exam, brackish estuary, where salt and freshwater systems meet. We'll come back to that later. It's part of our water pollution unit. In case you're wondering why we've kind of been all over the place lately, plate tectonics and soil and now water, what the heck are we actually doing? We're getting the basics down. We're learning how our Earth is put together and how it functions, and then we can start addressing actual environmental issues. So you guys are getting introduction to all the structures of the Earth. In fact, tomorrow we're going to do the atmosphere. So you'll now understand tectonics and dirt and water and the air, and then we can dive into real science. All right, what I've described to you so far is really the main concept known as a watershed. Notice there's an alternate name, drainage basin, which I prefer, but AP exam, they want you to know watershed. I think of a bathtub, right? A bathtub has a drain, and it's where all the water goes when you pull the plug. So that's what a watershed is. It's where all the water, when it rains, ends up. And you can see that big green area is the Wabash River watershed or drainage basin. And so the White River flows down through that. Here's the White. And actually the White River splits. We've got the East Fork and the West Fork, and they come together down here. And they actually only hit the Wabash for a little bit, way down here at the south. That's where our water ends up. Now, I also want you to realize the water in the White River, and we typically think of that as kind of gross, right? Have any of you swam in the White River? I have too. Good for you, Isabella. I took, I think, a 3-day shower afterward just to make sure. But yeah, I've spent some time in the White River.
You gotta make sure you wear shoes too. You don't know what's the bottom of that river.
For real. Yeah. I mean, full wetsuit and shoes and yeah, face mask and that. Not considered the cleanest of rivers. One of the reasons why is that some of the water from the White River comes from further up north. Okay, Noblesville's fine, whatever. But we've got Anderson and Muncie, which are sometimes very industrial. And year after year, we find out these companies pour chemicals in there when they're not supposed to. And we get what's called a fish kill. So a bunch of fish will wash up on the shore dead, and the environmentalists will go back and trace where it came from. They always catch them. These companies are always like, oh yeah, we screwed up, we poured it out. And they give them a fine, and they do it again because they don't care, it's just money. It's crazy. All right, so we already have been through this, but I want you to really understand that a watershed is defined by the scientist. If you want to just talk about the White River, then it's the White River watershed. If you want to talk about all of Indiana, well, it's the Wabash. You could call it the Mississippi watershed, right? And if you look at that bottom map, the Mississippi watershed is all those big rivers. They all have their own watersheds on the top map, but they're really just one big system on the bottom. So it depends what scale you're talking about, local or continental or global even, in terms of where the water ends up. I like to think of the Mississippi watershed, which dominates our country. The Mississippi watershed is really just a big funnel. Look at its shape, right? It's got a V shape and it all ends up down there in New Orleans. So it's just a giant funnel of the land. And that's exactly what a watershed is, where all the water drains in a particular area. Now, there are some factors that determine where your watershed occurs. And why does the water not go to the Pacific? You've probably heard of the Continental Divide. It's the Rocky Mountains, and it's the high elevation. The water can't get over the top of the mountains. So all the water to the east of the Rockies flows to New Orleans, and all the water west of the Rockies flows to the Pacific. Mountain ranges are natural divides. They determine where the water flows. In southern Indiana, why does our water go to the Wabash instead of just down south to the Ohio. Well, if you've been in southern Indiana, there's lots of hills. The water can't go over the hills. So it goes west instead of south. That little blue box with information in it is right out of the AP guide, but we've actually already covered this, right? Pretty much. A given watershed includes its area, how big it is. So that depends what you're studying. Its length. Well, once again, we could talk about Indianapolis to New Orleans. That's a pretty long watershed. We could be talking Muncie to Indianapolis. That's a small watershed. Its slope, right? How long does the water, or how fast does the water move in the river system? Transported soils, we've mentioned that. And of course, it's going to affect what kind of stuff grows there. Vegetation can also affect drainage. You'll notice that most rivers have a line of trees on each side of them, unless it's a big, wide open, flooded river like the Mississippi. So vegetation helps slow drainage. It can slow the residence time of the water. And then, of course, divides. And there you can see the big major watersheds of North America. Not all water has to move north to south. Water moves based on gravity. And so the Hudson Bay is lower elevation than all of those provinces, and everything flows toward the bay. Do you remember a while back I mentioned something called environmental unity? We talked about everything was connected. Isn't this a great example of it? The idea that Indiana is connected to the Gulf of Mexico. So if we take something like fertilizer and pour it on our lawn and it rains, where does that fertilizer eventually end up? It goes to the Gulf of Mexico. And what if millions of people in the Midwest spray fertilizer on their farm fields and their lawns? Where does most of that fertilizer go? Does it eventually end up in the Gulf of Mexico? Have any of you ever heard of a red tide or a dead zone?
Yeah.
Every spring, we put all this junk on our lawns and our fields, and it washes down, and a few weeks later, we get a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We are causing it. It's something we'll learn more about called eutrophication. Don't worry about that right now, but eutrophication is human caused, and each year, it seems to last longer and longer, the dead zone.
Isn't that like, it creates like this algae on the surface of it, and it just takes like all the oxygen out of the water, and then the stuff can't live in it?
So we create this algal bloom in the Gulf, and it suffocates, it asphyxiates the organisms, and so we'll have a big fish kill. Yeah, not a fun time to be down hanging out on the Gulf Coast when all those dead fish are washing up. All right, I've thrown plenty at you today. We're going to have a short lecture tomorrow, and then I've got story time on Thursday. It's a great one. It's a classic. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.